Hi, welcome to the podcast about nothing, where the podcast is about nothing, and somehow about everything. I'm your host, Daniel Chen. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsor, which is no one, because we suck. Someone please sponsor us. I'm literally using a sock as a pop filter. It's embarrassing. This will be episode 1 of the podcast. In today's podcast, we will be discussing autism. More specifically, we will be properly defining what autism is and what to be mindful of when raising a child with autism. I will also be showcasing an incredible interview with someone who has had a lot of experience with raising and growing up with a child with autism. I'm motivated to do this podcast because I've recently been doing some research on autism. And I've noticed there have been a lot of misunderstandings of what autism really is and how people with autism have been mistreated, especially autistic children. So hopefully today's episode can bring awareness about autism and hopefully bring awareness of what to be mindful of when raising a child with autism. I will be doing my best to stick with the facts when doing this. Alright, so who is this podcast for? Maybe you're curious about autism and want to learn more. I will say though, if you are really woke and don't believe in vaccines, you can just turn this podcast off. Why would you have to worry about autism? After all, there's no way your child could have autism because you didn't vaccinate them. Now, if you're a horrible parent that vaccinated your child because you care about their health and safety, you may want to listen on in the off chance your child might have autism. So, what exactly is autism? Autism is short for Autism Spectrum Disorder. It is referred to as a spectrum because it refers to a broad range of conditions characterized by impaired communication and social interactions. The conditions are also characterized by obsessive and repetitive behaviors. Autism arises from a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Because it is on a spectrum, the challenges of autism is not the same for every person. Some might need a lot of help to function, while others can be independent. Autism affects 1 in 54 children. Though autism is super sexist, it significantly affects more boys than girls. So how can you identify that a child is on the spectrum? Well, you can tell if they have horrible internet, and they keep getting junk mail to sign up for phone and television. Huh? Sorry, my producer told me that that's the wrong spectrum. So perhaps the most defining factor of autism is difficulties with social skills and verbal and nonverbal communication. This can be interpreted as being socially awkward, or missing body language or social cues like the person you're talking to is angry or disinterested. I remember watching a lecture by Dr. Fred Volkmar from Yale, and he discussed about an experiment that was conducted where they gathered people with and without autism and had them watch a movie scene, and then they tracked their eye movement. The scene featured 2 people having a conversation, and the researchers noticed that the people without autism, they focused on the people's faces that were talking, and then the people with autism, they were focused on everything else in the background. The way Dr. Volkmer described the results was that people with autism, their brains aren't terribly active towards things that are social, but they are hyperactive towards things that are non-social. This segues to the next characteristic of people with autism, which is they exhibit obsessive and repetitive behaviors. Because people with autism are hyperactive towards their surroundings, they notice things that people don't really notice and remember small details. People with autism typically have to have a very structured way of life, and things have to be very consistent. That may be in the form of having a daily routine that is exactly the same every time, or having things be in the same place all the time. Some examples of that is like having their desk in the same place every day at school, or having a toy put back in the same place every time. People with autism also exhibit obsessive behaviors. If they find something they enjoy, they may obsess over it, sometimes pouring their whole life into that thing they enjoy. It is suspected that several people in history who poured their life into a certain field and excelled at it had ASD. Those include Einstein, Mozart, Newton, and Darwin, just to name a few. In one of his lectures, Dr. Volkmer described a boy who he worked with. This boy obsessed over the subways in New York and remembered all the schedules of all the trains and what factors would contribute to the delay in a train, even if the delay wasn't reported. One day he told the boy that he might be late to one of their meetings because of the snow. Because of the snow, Volkmer had to take the subway. He got on the red line, and as soon as he got on, the boy called him and said, "Dr. Volkmer, do not get on the red line." And sure enough, 10 minutes later, the red line stopped. So this is just an example of some of the obsessive behaviors and attention to detail that is characteristic to autism. So now for the fun part. What are things that you need to be mindful of when raising a child with autism? I think one of the first things that needs to be addressed is sensory issues with children with autism. Children with autism can either be hypersensitive or overresponsive, or hyposensitive or underresponsive to stimuli. Some things to consider are dimmed lighting, avoiding scented products such as candles, and earplugs or headphones for loud environments. Also, avoid food that are, should I say, strong, such as food that is very spicy, textured, and hot or cold. Also, the clothing they wear should take in consideration of their personal sensitivities. For example, avoid clothing that is very itchy, like a flannel shirt, or avoid tight waistbands. Now, for children that are hyposensitive, you can imagine their accommodations are much in contrast with a child that is hypersensitive. Toys that are good for hyposensitive children are sensory stimulating toys. Things like a squishy toy with different textures, or if you remember the fidget spinner craze, the fidget spinner is a pretty good sensory toy. Pertaining to food, it's good for them to have strong tasting and or textured foods and cold beverages and things like that. Also, the way furniture should be arranged is so that there is as much open space as possible and as little risk of bumping into sharp or hard surfaces. Also, they should be given a lot of fun physical activities like running, jumping, throwing, dancing, etc. So how should one organize their living area to accommodate a child with autism? Well, as I mentioned before, the living area should be as wide open as possible and have as many hazards removed as possible. Also, a play area that is carefully designed is important. Some parents describe an area like this as a sensory area. Now, what things need to be considered when choosing a play area? Well, first thing to consider is how much supervision your child will need. If they need a lot of supervision, you should choose an area near where you spend most of your time. For example, near your office. Also, autistic children can have many challenges falling asleep. So it's a good idea to separate the play space from where they sleep. Also, as mentioned before, the space should be as safe as possible. So try to eliminate any hazards or child-proof the place. The play area should be lit in a specific way. So try to make the lighting as soft and soothing as possible. You can also use filtered natural light or add things like lava lamps or specified candles. Do your best to avoid fluorescent light, because fluorescent light can make autistic children feel very uncomfortable. Also, installing a dimmer on lighting is a good idea because then you can adjust the lighting based on their needs. Also, organization of the area is very, very important. An organized play space can provide a feeling of structure. In this play area, everything should have a specific place. That way, the child will know where to go when they want something or want to play with something specific. Things should be very easy to find for a child with autism. So, place toys on things like a shelf or in a storage bin that is clear and also labeled. In contrast, things that are not used too often should be kept out of view. There should be a sensory area that they can rest. Things that are textured are a must. Some examples are like a beanbag to sit on or a weighted blanket that they can put on. Extending from that, toys that stimulate touch are a must as well. Things to consider are like weighted stuffed animals or Play-Doh or anything with interesting textures. Also, it's important to stimulate their sense of hearing and smell. It can be good to play simple and soothing music for them, but also give the child the opportunity to turn it on and off. For smell, you should use calming and relaxing scents, using something like a candle or an essential oil diffuser. Next thing I want to talk about is the importance of having routine. It is important for autistic children to have a structured and consistent routine. That means as a parent, you will also have a structured and consistent routine with them. For example, with something as simple as going to bed, there should be a bedtime ritual. Doing things like making sure they're washed and tucked into bed at the same time every night. It's the same thing for in the morning, so mornings will probably be very frantic because they will want to be woken up and out the door at the same time every morning. That means as a parent, you will need to wake up even earlier and be ready to leave even earlier than them. Also consider that the child will want the same thing for breakfast every morning. So try to make sure that that thing isn't too hard to make. When they go to school, make sure their needs are accommodated for. It's good to speak to the teachers as well as the principal, and if available, any therapists they would need, such as a speech or physical therapist. That way, a good individualized education program or IEP can be made for your child. One difficulty with school is that it can be hard to maintain a strong routine. Things can be disrupted by things like change of curriculum or moving up to the next grade. It must have been very difficult for autistic children to deal with COVID-19 because it completely disrupted their routine in an instant. So now on to the interview. I had the very fortunate opportunity to speak with someone with experience with this topic. In fact, I actually met him through a video game discussion platform. He has a little brother with autism, and it actually inspired him to work in childcare. So let's have a listen. So hi, thanks for coming. First things first, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Uh, I live in Kentucky. Uh, I currently work in education. I work with middle grade students, so grades 6 through ninth. And my younger brother was diagnosed with autism when he was age 4. So I grew up with a child with autism in my household, and I've worked with children with autism in the workforce.
Okay, great. So, how and when did you discover that your brother had autism?
So I was born in 92, and my brother was born in 97. So I was 5 years older than him. And my brother was initially diagnosed in either 1999 or 2000. So he was 4 or 5 at that time. So I was old enough to recall this. And when he was diagnosed with autism, we initially were going in because he was nonverbal. He was showing that he had issues with sensitivity. So, like, he wouldn't want to wear clothes because they were itchy. He would only eat one or two particular types of food. Like, he was very big into macaroni and cheese, very big into pasta, and that would be basically all that he wanted to eat, almost obsessively. And he would, like, at that age, he was much bigger than other boys just because of how much he obsessed over eating. Like, it was a stimulus to him that felt good, so he kept doing it. And that's something he's had an issue with all his life. But when he was initially diagnosed with autism, at that time, we didn't particularly have a good dichotomy between what autism was and what retardation was. And when that initial diagnosis of autism was brought forward to my parents, I do remember the doctor initially saying, "We'll give you time to mourn the loss of your child," because it was a very big deal at that point. And it was hard for us to find information at that point about autism because it wasn't as widely known as it is now. We didn't really kind of get the mainstream popularization of autism until like 2010. So when we were looking up stuff on old compact computers and old HP computers and that kind of stuff on dial up, you just didn't have as much resources back then. And it very much was autism is retardation. And now, as we kind of grew with the research that was coming out at the time, we slowly started to understand more and more what autism was. And it wasn't that we were losing a child at that point. It was just that we had a child who had slightly different needs than anybody else. And that's nothing crazy. I mean, we also had a boy in our family. We had two children beneath him. There's 4 siblings in total, and one of them had ear tubes. And we were raised thinking that it's the same exact thing, that he just had some special need. And besides that, he was normal. It's just that he needed something extra in his life that the rest of us didn't.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting. So, what adjustments were made to accommodate your brother? Like adjusting your routine or rearranging the house?
So, 2 of the biggest things that he had was he had issues sleeping and he had issues with temper tantrums. He was nonverbal when he was younger, and he eventually grew out of that. But when he was initially nonverbal, he had trouble communicating his wants and needs, so he'd just break down and start crying. And one of the things that children with early autism have, I mean, early children with autism, like we're talking 3, 4 years old, is that they have sensory disorders sometimes. So for him, it felt like if he was just wearing a shirt that you and I would, like a flannel shirt, it felt like he was wearing an itchy, like steel wool sweater, and he didn't want to wear it. So most of the time, he spent his life in his underwear, and that became the norm for my family. And because I grew up and I wasn't like that, I still wore clothes, but because that's what he was used to, my younger sister and my youngest brother both, so his 2 younger siblings, also like wore underwear just because I thought it was a normal thing around the house, because that's what they grew up in. And for him, in order for him to be able to sleep, because he's struggling to sleep, he's in the blanket is itchy, almost like it's you just shaved and you didn't take a shower afterwards, you're just scratching all the time. For him to be able to settle down from that, we had an autism support group of other families that had autism, and it wasn't like an official thing. It was a just group of people who all went to the same therapist, I believe is what it was, or the same hospital, who happened to know that their children were autistic. One of the things that we found that worked were weighted blankets, and you can still find those, and those are still sometimes used for children with autism who have this kind of sensory uh, concern. So we got him a weighted vest, and it was a big gray vest, and it weighed about 5, 7 pounds, and it just had bean bags inside of it, basically, almost like how you'd imagine like where your 6-pack would be. There was like a bean bag in each slot, and it was on the back as well. And the weighted blanket was almost like it had a layer of cloth, and then it had sand on top of that, and then it was covered with another layer of cloth, so that way it would be kept in there. And those helped him sleep for the night. And the other thing that he got was a full body sock, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen one of those. What it is it's like a big, like elastic thing, and just the fact that his entire body was covered by it, I guess somehow helped him, like with his sensory needs. They kind of look like this. The best way to describe it would be almost like it's satin, or it's a shiny and smooth material, so it wasn't like the cloth that he was itching with, and he must have liked the insulation of it, I guess, from the outside world.
Wow, that's some great information. Thank you for sharing that. So, what resources did you use to learn more about autism to help better raise your brother?
So back then, we did not have organizations like Autism Speaks. We did not have the sort of popularized media where it's almost like there's been movies like August Rush, which shows a boy with autism who learns how to play piano, that kind of stuff. And it's almost been kind of seen as a good thing at this point. But back then, we didn't have that. We mostly had what we had was we went to a hospital, and that hospital did a summer camp. And by meeting other parents who had autism, we were able to say, these are the issues that our child has. Our child's struggling to sleep. He can't stay in bed because his blanket's itching him. Are you guys having any issues? And they're like, yeah, and we tried this and this and it worked, and we tried this and this and it didn't work. And sometimes you got crazy stuff from that, because one of the things that I clearly remember doing is that we had a gluten-free diet that we tried for him. And now, if a child had autism, a teacher or a psychologist would never say, let's try a gluten-free diet. That's just not something that would be considered developmentally appropriate or DAP. So at that time, we didn't really have much resources. When he started getting older, so when he turned about 10, 11, that's when he started going to middle school. And at that age, that's when he got a one-on-one assistant, an aide at his school. And that's not very common now because of how ratios work. Uh, Typically, it's like you need one worker for every 2 children or 3 children when you're in a special needs classroom. And back then, it was 1-to-1 because you just had more people who were interested, I guess, and we were in a smaller school district and he was blessed. And the fact was is that that particular aide actually got to stay with him for about 4 or 5 grades. So he was able to have that as a support unit, and we were able to learn things through her. And that probably was the biggest help. Once we got to high school, that's when it started becoming more mainstream. I graduated in 2010, so he would have been in 8th grade at that time, and that's when you start seeing more stuff up about on the news and on media and that kind of stuff, and you got more interest in researching it. And by that point, it was almost like it was a little bit too late for him, but he was still going through college. Well, he was going to go through college because he planned on doing it, and what we needed at that point was less pedagogical. So we didn't need academic resources. Our goal at that point, and that goal for any child once they hit a certain age, is that you have a detransition program. And the goal of a detransition program is to say your child is going to leave school and eventually he's not going to have that aide. He's not going to basically have that babysitter who helps him. So we need to figure out the way to make your child the most responsible for his own needs and the most independent that we can. And for every disorder, it's going to be different. If your child is has a severely low IQ and they can't take care of themselves, that's going to look extremely different than a child who has high functioning autism or Asperger. So at that point, our concern was finding ways that we could help him become independent. And for us, that started to look at things like, what do you want to do for your living? And he said he's interested in math and engineering. So we started looking at co-op opportunities, and we started to look at job shadowing. And that's the kind of stuff that you start looking at once you get older. So starting off, you would look more like, at the youngest age, you're looking more for what medically is up with autism. And for parents now, you would start looking at organizations like Autism Speaks. Once you get to about elementary, middle school, that elementary school is when you start making your IEP, which is your individualized education plan. And that is basically a list of goals that the child has, that the child's parents and the school has come up with. So it could be something as simple as we want our kid to count to 20. It could be something as simple as we want our child to be able to tie their own shoes, to be able to feed themselves. Or it can be as much as we are worried that he won't be able to provide for himself, so we want him to be able to learn how to cook meals. And it can be stuff like that.
Wow.
And the IEP will last with them all the way until they turn 18. I think it actually lasts until they turn 21, but most kids graduate at 18. So I think it actually lasts to 21. You can look that one up. IEP is something that's national. It's not a state law. So every child would be getting that. So you're worried more about the educational needs when they're in their elementary years. It'll carry on to their middle schools. And once you get into the late middle school, early high school, you start worrying more about the life skills and about how they're going to be able to take care of yourself. So it's almost like a 3-step kind of process when you're looking at these kids. And that's not unique to autism in any regards. It's just that's what we also had to go through ourselves.
That is some very helpful information. So, did your brother exhibit any repetitive or obsessive behavior? And how did it affect his life and your guys' life?
So back then, we inappropriately called them tics. And they're not really tics. They're closer to obsessions or fanaticism almost. He was really big into Pokemon. And to this day, he still plays Pokemon cards. He still plays Digimon games. He still plays yokai games. He still plays Monster Rancher and that kind of stuff. So he's still big into the monster collecting and that kind of stuff. When he was young, in the Pokemon games, there was such specific knowledge that's irrelevant to the video game that you're playing. Stuff like what color their eyes are and how big the Pokemon is and how much they weigh on average and what kind of footprint they have and what kind of growl they have. And because of how old video games used to work, there was only like 4 or 5 different growls a Pokemon could make. And when he heard one of the growls, he could tell you all 20 Pokemon that made that particular growl.
Wow.
You could show him the pixel of a footprint and he'd be able to tell you, okay, this type of Pokemon has this. It's just something that he had memorized, and it wasn't even useful for playing the game. It's just the fact that he liked it so much he wanted to know everything about it, even if it wasn't necessarily useful. And that obviously shows up in his house. So I mean, like his room is going to be covered in Pokemon stuff. It's going to be covered in like stickers and wallpapers and that kind of stuff. And for us, it was really useful to use. I use the word bribery, but the appropriate word is as it's extrinsic motivation. It's to motivate a child with something that's interesting to them that's outside of their body. So an intrinsic motivation for you might be, I really want to play this video game because it's fun. But an extrinsic motivation would be, I really want to play this video game because if I win it, I get $100 for winning. That's something that's outside of you that you want to do, where the fun is something internal. So we used extrinsic motivation with him whenever he was struggling with something. So if we had to go over to a family gathering and he didn't want to, we'd say, if you go, we'll get you a pack of Pokemon cards, and he is all about it now. If he doesn't want to study for the night or do his homework, if you don't, we'll take away your Pokemon game. You won't be able to play for the rest of the night, which is negative reinforcement rather than positive, but it works both directions.
Okay.
And I mean, at that point, it's like, I want to play more Pokemon games, so I'm going to do my homework. And we still use that in educational settings, but we've tried to move away from extrinsic motivation, because the idea is that if you keep working with a kid and all you motivate them with is rewards, then they no longer are working for the education, they're working for the rewards, so they're less likely to remember it. So that's something that we've tried to move away from, but we still use it all the time, especially when we're trying to work on behaviors. So nowadays you'll see it used a lot more for behaviors. So like for an example is that we've had a child who has autism and he really likes sour candy like Warheads, but he really struggles with schedules. So what we do for this child is that we give him a sour Warhead every time the bell rings to switch classes. And now he associates the bell ringing with reward, and then he also associates it with switching to classes. And we've winked him off of the candy, but he still knows it's time to change classes. And that's kind of how we would do it now. But back then, it was just give. Because, like I've said before, we tried stuff like gluten-free diets, and because we tried gluten-free diets, that's something that the entire family is participating in as well. So it's changing everybody's diet. When he's struggling to sleep, it's going to change everybody's sleeping routine because we all have to stay up because we hear him crying. Like I said before, with my two youngest siblings wearing underwear throughout the house, they were raised in the environment where it was normal for Blake to walk. Well, that's my younger brother's name. For him to walk around and just be in his underwear, where the youngest two were like, oh, that's normal. I can do that until I get old like my biggest sibling too. So it's going to change every part of your life, but it's not going to be a change in which you're unable to operate, if that makes sense. It's never been something that ever kept us from doing things. Like, we still went out and we still played sport teams when I was in middle and high school. My younger brother also played sport teams. My youngest sister played sports teams. So, I mean, we still went out and did social things. But a lot of the times, the main issue was that we had to stop things earlier, because where it might take a normal family 5 minutes to get ready, it would take us 30 minutes because we'd have to calm him down and get him to put on clothes and so on and so forth. So we still were able to do all the normal things an American family would do. It's just that we often had to prepare for it prior.
That must have been kind of expensive with all those Pokemon cards. Also, it's very interesting how the use of rewards are used for their development and how that's actually developing. So, did you or your brother experience prejudice due to his autism?
Prejudice. So when we were younger, I do remember, because at that time I was his older brother and I was at the same school with him. And because of how our age gap was, that would only be true in elementary school, because I'd be in fifth grade when he was in first grade. And after that, our middle school was 6 through 8, so there's too big of a gap there. And our high school would be 9 through 12, and there's too big of a gap there. So I only saw him at school in his elementary school years. And I do remember him being called stupid, and I do remember him being called dumb and that kind of stuff. It would be stuff like, if the entire class did well on a test, then we'd get a popcorn party and that kind of stuff. And because of his particular needs at that time, he was not able to do it. Like, he wasn't able to take the test period, or he wasn't in the classroom because he was receiving special services like occupational therapy or speech therapy or what have you. and because of that, the class wouldn't get that reward, and they would, make fun of him for that. In terms of like actual day-to-day stuff, he ended up becoming much more high functioning the older he got. His main issue now is that he has very high social awkwardness. A lot of his social conditioning he got from watching anime. So like whenever he tries to explain something, he will actually take his index finger, point up his glasses, like push them up his nose, and then raise his finger up into the air like he's explaining something like a cartoon character, because that's how he was socialized. A lot of the times we were spent going to therapy, and therapies for him were fun. Like, it's not like they were bad therapies or anything. It was stuff like, we're going to go to a summer camp with a bunch of other kids and we're going to do fun stuff. And I mean, I was jealous of that when I was a kid. So, I mean, it was fun stuff. It's just that a lot of his socialization was with other people who were autistic, other people who had mental retardation, other people who had Asperger's. So he never got inclusive treatment. And that's something that we do big now is we try to do something called most inclusive environment. I mean, least restrictive environment. Yeah. If you look it up, it's LRE. And that is a federal statute that says that whatever your child is, regardless of what their disability is, we're going to try to keep them in the public classroom as much as we can, because the more we keep them in the public classroom, the more socialization they get. And it works the other way, where these children learn empathy the earlier they are. So we actually didn't get to see much of a chance for him to experience any sort of discrimination based on autism, because he was being left in his special education classroom for so long. Nowadays, it's a little bit better because you're able to have the child in that inclusive classroom as young as they can be, as inclusive as they can be. And for some kids, it can be, we only have to take you out for 10, 20 minutes for speech therapy, and you're good. For some of these kids, it's, we have to take you out for almost all the day. Some of these kids are just, you can be with the classroom the entire time, but because you're a paraplegic, you can't go to PE. I mean, it's just going to be different on the kid. So it's better now in some regards, but because they're in that more inclusive environment, there is more chance for that harassment. And we didn't personally experience it, but I do have some memories of him being called dumb and stupid. But in general, because he was with the other special education children, it wasn't that big of a deal. I personally was never like made fun of for having an autistic brother, but that's because of my age gap. I don't know if my younger siblings experience the same thing, and they're not around for me to answer or ask them. And some of that could have happened with them, but in general, he wasn't particularly social outside of that special education circle. So everyone around him, it'd be almost contradictory for the kid with Asperger's to make fun of the kid with autism for having autism, you know? So that kind of stuff just didn't really happen.
Okay. All right. That's thank you for sharing that. That's good to know.
You're all good.
Yeah. So, is there any final things you'd like to share? Any final thoughts? This is your platform.
There are. So autism kind of has the same issue as breast cancer at this point. The biggest organization that we have for autism is called Autism Speaks. You've probably heard of it before.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the biggest organization for breast cancer is that Susan B. something, I don't know, the Pink Ribbon Group.
Mm-hmm.
And Autism Speak has the same issue that we have with that breast cancer awareness, that it's almost more about awareness than it is for actually educating or doing research about autism. Uh, Autism Speaks was founded by Susan and Bob Wright, and that's where you get all these blue puzzle pieces all over the landscape. I'm sure that you've seen that, where like you'll have a puzzle piece on somebody's car, like a magnet, and that's for autism awareness.
Okay, I got you.
A lot of autistic families have had issues with the organization, and it's hard for me to speak because I'm personally not autistic, so I find it difficult for me to hold issue with something that doesn't directly correspond to me. It'd be like me having an issue of breast cancer, even though I don't have breast cancer, you know?
Yeah, gotcha.
And they do a lot of stuff for awareness, but at a certain point, awareness, like everybody's already aware of the disease, which is kind of iffy. You can find a lot of different groups who have had issues with Autism Speaks, and most of the times it's the issue is almost like you're homogenizing children with autism or adults with autism. And autism is a spectrum. That is in the name of the disorder. It is a spectrum. There are some people who have very high functioning autism. There's some people who have very, very severe autism that prevents them from functioning in the day-to-day life. And there are some issues with homogenizing it. And there's been some issues with stigmatizing autism, even with Autism Speaks. I know that Forbes had a really good article a couple of years ago, like 2015, somewhere in that range, about it. So it's been a known issue that a lot of people who are autistic dislike the organization. But at the same time, it's also the organization that's kind of been able to go out and say, hey, autism is a thing that affects a lot of us. And then we've got more people interested in researching it in more colleges. So it's, you have to kind of take the good with the bad. One of the things that I told you before is that the best way that we can actually cater to children who have autism or adults who have autism is that we need programs that have diverse solutions. It's going to be a lot of local programs that do that. The example that I gave earlier was the Michelle P. Waiver, which is done through a group called Life Skills in the state of Kentucky. And what they do is they basically give you a budget. For us, it was like $800 a month. And what you would be able to do is use that $800 a month and hire mentors, hire babysitters, hire therapists, whatever you needed to do. And they would fill out time cards. We've even hired somebody just to transport him back and forth before when we couldn't do it ourselves. So, I mean, as long as it was something that would actually help them. And the reason that's so helpful is that for our case, we mostly needed him to be able to socialize more. So for somebody to help him, take him out to gatherings and make sure that he wasn't being too awkward and be able to let him experiment with socialization. We needed to have tutors once he got into college. We needed to have somebody to help him learn things like how to cook and how to drive and things like that. For another family, it could be that they need somebody who's going to give him more support, like they need somebody to change out the colostomy bag. It could be like they need to have their child cabbed, something like that. And because autism is such a diverse spectrum, having a solution like that would really let you tailor what your child needs. Issue with Michelle P. Waiver is that there's very little accountability. The accountability of that program is making a time card, writing it down, and writing down on a timesheet what you do with that child for what hours of the day. And in reality, you can kind of BS that if you really wanted to. So I've like heard of families who have just said, "Oh, we'll sign up our child for this program, and we'll have their sibling write down that they worked with them for so many hours, and they'll get a fat $600 check at the end of every month that they didn't really work for." So that's the issue with it. But I do think that the benefit of having such a diverse solution, so that way you're able to say, this is the severity of my child, this is his particular needs, this is the group of people who I need to help get this accomplished, is going to be much more helpful than the damage that's caused by the one or two bad people who are necessarily going to go out and say, hey, I can abuse this. Because you see the same thing with food stamp cards, and we see food stamp cards around because we acknowledge that they do more good than harm. And it's a lot of the same thing. I think that's all I have, unless you have more questions about like how we teach kids with autism or anything like that.
I mean, do you want to talk about that? I can, but
I mean, a lot of that stuff is that once they start off school, they start with an IFSP, which is an Individualized Family Service Plan. This is all in the IDEA Act of 2003. It's spelled IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They start off with their IFSP, and that includes the entire family and its goals the families have. So the goals could be like, we're struggling to sleep at night, we need to help make a relevant sleep schedule. And oftentimes use a program like First Steps or Early Interventionalist or Developmental Interventionalist to come into the actual household to teach that. Once they go into preschool, then they have to switch to an IEP. IEP is what they use for the child exclusively. So IFSP was the family, IEP is just the child. And the IEP has to be made with the entire family there. It has to be done with the people who are going to provide them services. Like if there's an OT there or an aide that's going to work with him, they got to be there. And you have some teachers there as well to represent the school. And the child is going to keep the IEP all the way until they graduate high school or they turn 21, I think is what it is. It's either 18 or 21, whichever one comes first, I forget. And for a lot of places, like my younger brother went to Western Kentucky University. If they had an IEP, then they're able to receive additional services, even though the IEP technically doesn't do anything at that point. So it's still helpful after that point. So, like, you've probably heard of colleges having their Department for Disabilities or whatever, or the accommodations department, that kind of stuff. So, like, he was able to go in and get somebody to take notes for him. So they went to that class at the very beginning of the year and said, hey, if you're willing to let us photocopy your notes for the class and you have good handwriting, we'll pay you money so that way he can have it. I mean, they didn't say his name, but that's what they did. They said, we're buying your notes, basically.
Okay.
Because he's not fast enough to write with his hand the notes or type the notes. And that's just one of the accommodations that I gave to him. So we've got more solutions now than we did back then, if that makes sense. And we're willing to outsource more when it's appropriate.
Thank you very much for taking your time to talk to us.
Yeah, no problem, dude.
So that was the interview. And honestly, that was a great interview. And I'm so grateful that he took the time to talk to me. Well, not only does that conclude the interview, but the podcast as well. Thank you for listening to the podcast about nothing. I'll see you next episode. Who knows? Bye-bye.